Hello and welcome to War of the Human Tanks ALTeR. I would like to briefly go over this game because I've spent a lot of time in it and I probably should have gone over this game a while ago. So the first screen that you're introduced to here in War of the Human Tanks ALTeR is obviously the title screen. There's several options ranging from, starting a new game, loading a game, going into the system files, which will allow you to alter how the game goes. You can skip stuff and things like that. There's a movie mode for if you've already kind of beaten a bunch of stuff. You can then go back and kind of rewatch the things that you've already seen. I think sound mode just lets you play tracks from the game, which is pretty cool as well. And yeah, but let me load a game real fast. I'm gonna be loading my game that's already 34 hours, 33 minutes, and 26 seconds in. And we'll be talking about this game a little bit. This is the hub. This is where everything happens. Um, currently, I'm currently in this state. I'm in intermission, which means I'm between missions. Between missions, you're allowed to look over your units, develop new tanks / modules. Modules are things that can be put onto a tank. They're like an accessory that can be put onto to a tank to make it stronger. So in an RPG sense, they're an accessory that you could put onto a character, and the character would then be more powerful. You can also assemble tanks and modules that you've already developed here. You can also choose to discard, which means destroying, breaking down a tank or a module that you've built. You're breaking it down to get back a fraction of its price to then put forth towards building your army. You can, again, system files are still here. From this area, you can save the game, load the game, you can go to the title screen, you can quit the game, and you can look at the route that you're currently taking in-game. So that is a pretty cool thing. There are also, from this screen, you can go to free battles. So the free battle screen is a mixture of battles that you've already played through like the story or the Great Cavern of Fuji, but there are also some battles that are crafted specifically for the free battle, and they are unlocked by playing the story and by playing Fuji. Eventually you can unlock some extra battles that are specific towards the free battle area. Some of them have a little story to them, some of them don't. Sometimes you gain it's a bonus, a tank for doing a story, or for doing a free battle, but they're just like a little extra thing to kind of throw in there. Obviously the next episode button would take me to the next episode, which for me is episode 3 of the main campaign, which has I think 12 episodes to it. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure that's what it does. And then there's the cavern. Now, the Cavern of Fuji is a tremendously large dungeon. As you can see, I'm at floor 74. It's a tremendously large dungeon that you can play down through, and like games like Dark Cloud, Racketeer, the further you go, the harder it gets. But unlike games like Dark Cloud and Racketeer, its difficulty kind of goes in spans of 5. So you're not every floor isn't necessarily harder than the last, but it might introduce something, or it might have a gimmick of some sort. There are also battles that are completely just set up to let you regain supplies after what would be a particularly hard fight. But let's go into this real fast because I can explain some more stuff from floor 74 of the cavern. Once you actually settle in and you want to go to I need to skip this so I don't ruin this for myself. Once you actually pick a battle, you'll be brought to the screen here. This is the hub for battles. Again, you can choose to assemble tanks that you've already made, but you cannot choose to develop things because your engineer can't sit back in the back lines and adequately make up new stuff when you're at a battle. She's obviously watching the battle as well, and she has to do tank maintenance afterwards. She doesn't have the time to sit back and study in that sense. So you can still make things that you've already made, but you can't make the new stuff. You have to do that from the intermission screen. Now, I'm going to deploy a few tanks, and then I'm going to kind of talk about what each tank does real fast. But I want to talk about the deployment. So first, the deployment is where you can throw down the tanks that you own, and you can start setting them up in any way you want. You can add modules that you have to them from the module list. Whatever you've made, you can put onto tanks. You can then go into the formation screen, and maybe you don't want a tank to be where it is. You can move that tank to a new location, or you can take it completely off the battlefield. Again, there's a discard. You can turn tanks that you don't want or modules that you don't want into supply if you're in a pinch and you need that supply. You have access to the system scenario again, obviously same thing as before. There is also a bar that is above the game, which contains several things. One of them is system, which that's what you can do with the system. There's settings. Some of these settings are different than the settings that you've seen in the system file of the actual game. In specific, that would be sound. You can't access the sound via the system of the game. You have to use this upper bar, which is always there. It's a bar that's always there. It's a help bar, pretty much. There is also a help option that'll take you to some stuff that might help you out in the game. And then there's an option for message skip, which means that anything you've already seen, you just skip through. Now let's talk about the tanks. So the first thing you need to know about this game is that it's grid based. If you have a grid, you place tanks on the grid and you move them. Now we'll go into more detail on that in just a little bit, but I can't really, it's hard to explain it. Each tank can only take about one hit unless they take up more than one space. So like Battleship in that regard. So this tank here can take 2 hits because she occupies 2 spaces, whereas that tank would die in 1 hit because she only occupies 1 space. During your turns, you're able to move and fire and all of that, and you have to choose which parts of the grid, X and Y and X, that you want to fire upon, and where you want to move and all that. So there are separate things here. As you can see, each tank has a separate whole separate scale of items that's available to them, from shooting range, shooting area, scouting range, scouting area. The difference between those ranges are how far it can go. Area is how big it is. Sight range is how far the tank can see around it. So if you have a sight range of 1, you can only see 1 square around you. If you have a sight range of 2, you can see 2 squares around you. It's pretty simple like that. Move and speed are 2 different things. Now, speed is how fast the tank will get its turn. This game has a little bit of a turn system, whereas as long as you're not clicking on something, as long as you're in the over screen, watching over the battlefield and letting your tanks, charge up. We'll use Final Fantasy as an example because that's actually a great point. Final Fantasy has that little bar that kind of charges up, and then you're able to take the turn as the character. Well, there's an invisible bar for each tank that charges up based on their speed, and then they can take their turn. Movement is how far they're allowed to move on their turn. So in the case of Sapphire here, she can move 3 squares. So she'll move 3 squares up or whatever, and then she'll attack. Now, the game revolves around defending a tank known as a command tank. A command tank is a tank that is able to fight, and it might be able to fill various roles, such as a artillery, assault, or shock. But while they can fill any position, they're also very, very important to your lines, because if all of your command tanks are destroyed, you lose the game, regardless of how many tanks you've left on the field, because they won't have a commander to direct them. While you are the commander, you're commanding your tanks through a conduit, which are what these command tanks are. So these are your most important tanks that you need to be defending at all times during the battle. You can also, if you choose, use them to try and turn the battle in your favor, especially if you have multiple command tanks deployed. The next tank type is artillery tanks. Now, there are two types of artillery tanks, but we're going to get into the second type later. Artillery tanks are exactly what they sound like. They are a long-range unit. They sit in the back and they bombard the battlefield deeper in. In later stages of the game, you'll see enemies use something called evasion. Evasion is a property that allows enemies to evade attacks. And what it seems like is that they are very, very, like, that's a very big deal for artillery tanks, because I very rarely see artillery tanks hit a evasion tank, because the missiles are slower than a gun bullet or a laser beam, I guess, and they're able to see it sooner and evade it. There's also an interceptor type tank that can negate fire from artillery tanks by intercepting their missiles with, with their missiles of their own. I don't know how you can really say it. So artillery tanks do kind of become a moot point at the end of the game, but before then they're pretty good. They sit in the back and they just long range and bombard whatever you need, just like artillery in real life. There's a secondary scale of artillery tank called a control tank. Now, the control tanks work in the exact same way as the artillery tanks. The only difference is the control tanks have a special ability that nullifies modules. So those little accessories that you put on your character, well, the control tanks will destroy those. They will not destroy them, but disable them. Obviously, your control tank doesn't disable your army's modules, it disables the enemy army's modules, but the enemy army can deploy control tanks as well. So you never really know if you're going to be able to bring the accessories that you want with you into a battle. And the next type of tank is an assault tank. Basically, an assault tank, all they are frontline tanks. They're the tanks that charge forward. They're generally pretty fast and have good movement, and they're up in the middle of the fight like up in the middle of the enemy lines, firing on them and trying to outmaneuver them. There's a secondary class of assault tank, which are, where's a good example here? There, the sniper tanks. The sniper tanks are technically counted as assault tank type. A sniper tank works in the same way as the artillery tank, except that the sniper tank still has much better speed. It's got the speed of an assault tank, but it works range-wise like an artillery tank. It sits in the back and it fires a shot that can't be dodged. So those evasive enemies that you couldn't hit before, that's what you use the sniper tank on. They'll destroy those guys for you. Moving on again, we get to the shock tanks. A shock tank is a tank that self-destructs in order to destroy enemies. So it will run up to, it's a kamikaze fighter. It runs up to an enemy, and then it uses whatever bomb it has, whether that be a grenade or in more hilarious fashion, a orbital tracking device that'll get like an orbital laser to fire on their location. They run up and they destroy themselves in order to take out whatever enemies they can. Their ranges vary, but they're always centered on it because it's the cause of the explosion. So, however, there are different types of shock tanks. The first other type of shock tank that we're going to look at is the fight tank. Fight tanks aren't really shock tanks. I would classify them a little bit more as assault tanks, because they run straight up into the enemies and they have to be very close to the enemy in order to hit them, because they're actually punching people in the face. They fight with their bare hands, well, with their boxing gloves, and they have a fast movement speed, and they also have a haste device, which means they automatically get a turn at the very start. So they're a very good unit, and you generally will see. They also have an ability to kill evasive enemies, so they're a very great unit that can charge in, hit people, and kind of duck back out, hit and run style, and it's pretty good. There's also a tank called a samurai tank. A samurai tank works in the exact way of a shock tank, except not. I know that's a little bit conflicting, but they have to move close to enemies, and they have an attack that's centered on themselves. However, they're not blowing themselves up. They're using a katana and taking a swing. So the attack radius would be, how far they're swinging at their enemies. And certain shock tanks can do different types of swings based on their abilities. Then you get to the recon tanks. Any good army needs to be able to see what it's fighting, because otherwise, you're not going to know where the enemy tanks are. Recon tanks help in that sense because they can't really fight very well, but what they can do is scout, and the scouting ability reveals the battlefield to you. So they're there to help your other tanks locate the enemy, so you're not going in blind. Then obviously the interceptor tanks are there to nullify artillery. And that's about it. That's most of the tank types in the game. There are some other tanks that do various things, but for the most part that's all you need to know about it. And now I just want to talk about War of the Human Tanks ALTeR versus War of the Human Tanks. So obviously this is a grid-based game where you kind of have to, it's a grid-based, turn-based strategy is what I like to refer to it as. It's a mixture of Battleship and I don't know, just so many games. Like it's such a mixture. But in regards to War of the Human Tanks ALTeR, the main storyline that's presented to you in the game, honestly isn't as good as the main storyline that is presented to you in War of the Human Tanks, the original game. The storyline's a little bit weak. It's a lot weaker. The original storyline for War of the Human Tanks, the original game, is there's 4 endings to it. It's very well developed. It has antagonists who are developed. It's a very strong storyline. But that game doesn't have sniper tanks. Those were a new addition. It doesn't have fight tanks. It doesn't have control tanks. It's a much more basic game. So it's also easier to learn than ALTeR. So I always recommend playing the first game of a series before moving on to another game in the series, and in this case, that's definitely a big thing, because the storyline is given to you in a visual novel-esque style, as we previously kind of saw a little bit of, where you're given pictures and you're told what's going on, and where the Human Tank won, like the original War of the Human Tanks Charge. Its story was very well developed all the way through, and it's also a simpler game that will allow you to kind of learn what the basic tanks do, and then you'll be introduced to these new tanks in ALTeR, but you'll already know what the older tanks do, so you won't have as hard of a transition. War of the Human Tanks ALTeR is mostly centered around the Great Cavern of Fuji. Yes, you have to beat the main campaign before you can really get into the Great Cavern of Fuji, and the main campaign storyline is unfortunately not that good. But what it comes down to is War of the Human Tanks ALTeR is more for, I would say, the people who really enjoyed the gameplay of War of the Human Tanks. If you're not as mindful of the story, you don't care as much, and you just want to play this cool grid turn-based game, that's ALTeR for you. Now, even the main storyline, the scaling of the battles isn't done right, in my opinion. War of the Human Tanks 1 did a much better scaling job, but Fuji is a great scaling battlefield. It's every floor is better and better and better and better. There are gimmicks, there's fun stuff to do, and it takes the whole idea of the grid-based, turn-based strategy, and it just takes every part about it that you've done so far, and it just changes it up, and it's so much fun. It's a good time for anyone who is interested more in the gameplay rather than the story. But the Great Cavern of Fuji also does have a story. Unfortunately, it's not a very it can't be called a strong story because it's not exactly given to you per level. So you kind of get bits and tidbits at various points during the cavern, and that kind of isn't going to work out for a lot of people. But for me and for a lot of other people who might be interested in like who interested in the universe of the War of the Human Tanks, it's a very interesting story, but it's pieced out very farly. And obviously, I'm 34 hours in. The game takes quite a long time to get through if you're going through Fuji. And I just want to say again, if you're looking for a storyline, and even for like just a starting game, I would definitely pick up War of the Human Tanks, the original, which I think is the original game is I think $10, while War of the Human Tanks ALTeR is 13. ALTeR takes a lot more time than the original game, so I would definitely suggest picking up the original game to learn the game and to have a story that's fun and enjoyable, as well as to just kind of break you into the game and stuff. And then if you're really into the battling, or the world of the War of the Human Tanks, then pick up War of the Human Tanks ALTeR. But if you're not, you don't want to maybe you don't want to make the time commitment, then look up some stuff, because War of the Human Tanks ALTeR is a pretty cool storyline in itself after the main campaign. Like, Fuji's a cool storyline in itself, and a lot of the matches are very cool visual fights. So if you're interested in the battlings, interested in that grid-based, turn-based style, then after you play the first game, I would suggest buying the second. But the second is a giant time sink, and that's really it. It's a giant time sink that starts off very slowly, and you really just want to get into the Great Cavern of Fuji, because that's where the fun is. So that's kind of like been my explanation and my thoughts on the games. Sorry that it dragged on a little bit. I don't usually do this kind of video. I just thought I should, because I've played both of them, and I've played them both for so long. So I thought maybe I should try to explain what's kind of going on in the game to people who might not know yet, and kind of introduce them to the game. So, yeah. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you'll pick up one of the games and try it out for yourself, because they are pretty fun. You will often see War of the Human Tanks, the original, on bundles, and Fruit Bat Factory, who localize the game, they're very helpful. They'll help you out if you need any questions. You can post it on their forums, and they'll help you out in pretty quick time. So it's a good game to buy, and it's a good game to start getting invested into if you want, because you've got that support system there, and you've also got just a pretty good gem that is War of the Human Tanks. So thank you for watching.